31st of January 1919, a protest in Glasgow turns violent. The passing of time sometimes changes how we perceive events. Sources go missing. Different interpretations arise. Those present at the events die, and their stories with them. This can cause some inaccuracy about the said events. Misconceptions become myths that cloud the judgment of what happened and why. The Battle of George Square is a perfect example of this. 82 days after the armistice, peace was simply a political state, not a description of Britain at the time. War was over. The amount of soldiers and industry workers simply needed to be reduced. With that comes the obvious reduction of employment, and with that comes social unrest. On the last Friday of January 1919, a 4-day strike came to a violent end. The River Clyde cuts through the heart of Glasgow, and as such, the city built its industry upon shipbuilding and engineering. A huge amount was needed for the war. After the war, however, not so much. Those who still retained their jobs began a strike to reduce their working week from 47 to 40 hours. Their reduced hours would make more jobs available to their fellow unemployed. 3,000 men stood in the square on Monday. By the Friday, over 25,000 men were there. They were cheering on a committee attended by strike leader and communist MP William Gallacher. Banners brandishing justice were being carried by the anticipating crowd. They were waiting to see what the Lord Provost had said about their petition, to see if they were going to get justice for the other shipbuilders, to see if the strike would work. In the morning, the Riot Act was read to the protesters. At noon, the police charged them with batons. Violence begets violence. A spark had triggered an explosion. A battle had begun. When the police charged the strikers, they fought back, weaponizing bottles and stones. Well over 40 people on either side were injured and taken to infirmaries to be treated. Gallacher was arrested. Just 3 hours after the outbreak, soldiers were converging on the city, preparing to intervene. Or more. An outnumbered police force had to retreat, lest it be defeated. In the evening, although the violence had dissipated from the square, it had actually spilled into streets surrounding it. The fight was spiraling out of control. Born out of desperation or realization of the seriousness of the situation, the authorities deployed mounted police to tackle the mob. Anger moved from the forces to the city itself. The night fell, bringing with it destruction. There were widespread reports of vandalism on local buildings. Shops were attacked, their contents looted. An approximate 24 trams had been targeted too. Was this about the strike anymore? Was it just fear, anger, desperation, revolution? The city was in turmoil. Not even 100 days after the war had ended, and the government needed the military again. This time, however, it was on their own soil. By 10 p.m. on the Friday, the first of 10,000 infantrymen had arrived. The previous year, they faced the Germans. Now, they may have to face their own brethren. By Monday, the 3rd of February, soldiers were not enough. There were tanks on the street. Where car parks and traffic jams are now, there were tanks preparing for the worst in 1919. Accounts of the time indicate that there were crowds of around 30,000 strikers present. A clash between this huge crowd and the military would have been very bloody indeed. It may even been seen as martyrdom or as tyranny, and it may have inspired strikes across the country. But who is to say the army would have actually fired upon the strikers? A soldier knew the shipbuilder's struggle. They may have even known the shipbuilder personally. If just one soldier had refused to intimidate their own, it could have birthed a mutinous wave of solidarity, a workers' revolution. Could one soldier have led to a Bolshevik Britain? Myths and misconceptions surround the strike. In TV programs, books, and even school lessons, The story goes that Churchill himself sent the tanks against the demonstrators. Dr. Gordon Berkeley, however, argues the evidence does not support this. As he phrases it, what circulates as fact about the deployment of the army to Glasgow in 1919 is not supported by primary evidence. Indeed, Dr. Berkeley postulates that this was a dramatisation of the past, drummed up in an age of propaganda and circulated in an age of social media. It would appear the press of the past supports this argument too. Not a single newspaper account of the time mentions a thing about sending in tanks on the infamous Bloody Friday, as the battle has become known as. The Sheffield Evening Telegraph did confirm on the Saturday that troops were present. This reaffirms what we already know, including that no tanks had been sent in, especially not against civilians. They are not the only ones. In the Aberdeen Press and Journal, on the Tuesday, an article was written highlighting that the military was reinforced yesterday by 6 tanks. By yesterday, they of course meant Monday the 3rd, when Dr. Berkeley and I state that the tanks did actually arrive. Moreover, it was to reinforce the military, not driven directly at the crowd like some myths pose. The Dundee Courier, although labelling it illegal use of the military, specified that troops were on guard and not used against the civilians, and they certainly don't mention tanks being used against them. What about the fear of Bolshevism? There would be great cause for fear of a communist uprising, surely. Not 2 years prior, Russia underwent its drastic and infamous 1917 revolutions, transforming it into the Soviet Union. The Spartacist uprising that happened in Germany of the same month of the George Square conflict. Revolutions and socialism were sweeping the continent. The British government was unmistakably scared the UK may suffer the same. Whether this battle posed an actual threat of revolution, however, is something that Berkeley is adamant against, simply stating there was no evidence that it was a Bolshevist uprising. Despite fears, therefore, there was no indication that it was actually a Bolshevik-inspired strike that intended to go revolutionary. Although not every newspaper at the time believed that, with riots going on in Belfast, the whole Daily Mail thought that this was the beginning of the end. They supported the use of tanks, writing on the day of their arrival that they were there to stop Bolshevism. They pointed to other labour disputes as fear that these riots would conform into a full-blown workers' revolution. The Hull Daily Mail were, however, renowned for their hard conservative stance and set out to renounce liberal newspapers at the time. Therefore, they may have been eager to quell any inspiration this riot may have led to. Or they may have said it out of fear that any worker dispute in a time of European revolution and uproar was a clear attempt at British revolution. They were not the only ones. The Newcastle Daily Chronicle reported to them as being Bolshevik ringleaders, accusing them of being agents of the Soviets. This was also published 3 days after the tanks had rolled into Glasgow too, and so they had time to realise if there was any Bolshevik activity. Despite this, they substantiated no evidence of an actual revolution. Interestingly, Joseph Cowan, the owner of the Newcastle Daily Chronicle, was a staunch liberal. Perhaps it was less a fear of Bolshevism, and maybe it was hope that this could have spiralled into a revolution. Either way, the amount of newspapers across the country, ranging from the Aberdeen Press and Journal to the Belfast Telegraph to the Sphere based in London, evidences how widespread the news the Battle of St. George had become. Obviously, news travels fast, and riots would of course be reported upon across the nation. To have been labelled Bolshevik by some, especially in times of such labour upset across the continent, however, does suggest the press feared what the outcome of this battle might have been. The most interesting article presented was from the Women's Dreadnought, who vehemently attacked the police for their unprovoked attack. Although they did not state there was any Soviet activity, the article leaves a taste of Bolshevik spirit in the mouth when they stated that the workers will not forget. This may also be explained by the background of the newspaper company. The Women's Dreadnought was established to provide news supporting the suffragette movement in the UK. Therefore, they may have been showing solidarity with oppressed groups such as the workers, especially in the face of what they considered tyranny and the police authority. Moreover, the Women's Dreadnought was established by Sylvia Pankhurst, a key suffragette. Not only did she stand up and fight for the liberation of women, but she was also an open communist. Perhaps, therefore, that is why she stood directly in solidarity with the workers, not just out of sympathy, but also in an attempt to influence the fellow workers of the world that there was serious oppression and that this should be the start of something bigger. The socialist Edinburgh, too, said the workers will not forget, echoing her words, and also criticised the police very heavily for attacking the workers, especially as they too pointed out it was unprovoked. Eager to learn and spread the news that life would carry on as normal, most other newspapers celebrated the downfall of the strike. The Falkirk Herald on the 8th of February announced the military presence had prevented any renewal of disturbances. By the 18th of February, all military had left, and the strikers gave up on their mission for a 40-hour work week. Gallacher later revealed that the strike was simply that, a strike, and not an attempt at a revolution. But he had wished it had been. He commented in 1936, "We were carrying on a strike when we ought to have been making a revolution." Along with the other strike leaders, Gallacher was trialled in April. He received a sentence of 5 months in prison. The newspaper The Scotsman commented on the 10th of April that the trial was well filled with spectators, showcasing how much public interest was invested in the strike leaders' future and what it could mean for future labour disputes. Despite its scars, Glasgow had returned to normality. Was Britain a hair's length away from its own Bolshevik revolution? Gallacher believed so. He was convinced if the strikers convinced the army to join their cause, they could have ignited a fiery uprising. While many historians now believe it to be solidarity rather than revolutionary, we can only imagine what would have happened should the army have joined their cause. The myths of the Battle of George Square remain to this day, but simply put, the evidence suggesting that Churchill directly sent tanks against the protesters themselves is just not there. Nonetheless, nearly 30,000 men came out to rally against the conditions in which they and their fellow workers suffered. Soldiers lined the streets where high street shoppers now walk. The Great War had ended, but the fight for a peaceful life was far from over.